come with increased anticipation for the art and presentation of Dr. Pacini. Welcome back. We look forward to learning and being stretched again. Thank you.
It is good indeed to be back. It's especially joyful because I finally won. I beat Doc. I have a pocket square. And, you know, it's hard to get ahead of Doc. And he hid from me the whole evening and finally came over and conceded before we had a word. He just said, well, okay, you win. You finally got dressed right. And I thought, ah. So I'm delighted to be here. Well, we're closing in now. We have tonight, in which we're going to talk a lot about Zephaniah. And we have next week, in which we're going to try to draw the threads of this conversation together and to discern one way of interpreting resurrection. Remember, I indicated to you that there is a tradition that moves through the stories of holy history, of God's intervention in human history, and experiences growing anticipation and eagerness to discern resurrection. And part of what we've been doing is discovering that this particular course that we've been following leads us to some new discoveries that may not have been part of our tradition before. Thus far, now, we're going to talk about quieting love. Thus far, I've said that the tradition of the liturgical practice of the great vigil of Easter, which is a practice that's observed in many, many churches, Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, begins with the story of creation, with God separating light from darkness. And Michelangelo wisely views God from the bottom side up so that he cannot see and we cannot see the face of God. So this is an incomprehensible mystery, which is then followed by the displeasure of God with his creation in the flood. Michelangelo foregrounds the excruciating suffering of the flood. And in the background, you see the ark with Noah's hand outstretched, sending off the dove. So we begin with the promise of a new world and then the judgment on all of us who, because frail and fragile, lose our way and become more preoccupied with our own ways of doing things than God's. The next pair of stories is the horrifying story of the near sacrifice of Isaac. And that's underscored by the fact that God had made a promise that Abraham's family would be the new people of God. And so Abraham is put to the test, but so is Isaac. And in Rembrandt's version, there's a kind of a a copy of which, by the way, hangs in your church. Doc showed me it, so that's why I chose this one. You may have seen this before, wandering the back steps of your church. The fascinating thing about this is the irradiance of the innocence of the body of Isaac, making this whole venture even more unconscionable. Rembrandt does this. We're going to run into Rembrandt a couple more times before we're done. Rembrandt has this lovely habit of fixing stories. He does what we're doing. He does a midrash. He does a little story on the side. So here he's added something, this luminescence of the body of Isaac. So his point is to underscore the innocence, the radical innocence of Isaac. And that story is coupled with, in the tradition of the liturgy, the Exodus. And the Exodus, of course, is through the Red Sea, but it involves a great deal of death and suffering. So one of the themes here is that these stories begin to foreground the tension between promise and judgment, and also keep before our eyes always the sorrow and sadness that goes along with these events in which people fall short of their covenantal promises to God. This is one of my favorite stories. This is Isaac. And Isaac and Baruch teach us something about saving wisdom, and saving wisdom is not what we think it is. Saving wisdom is a prayer for peace. Saving wisdom is an idealized sense of a world in which all are in peaceable relation one with another. But the way in which this word of the peaceable love of God comes is through the paradoxical, fiery placing of an ember, a live ember, on Isaac's tongue. And this is such an enormous event because what he's saying, and what Isaac's going to say, and what Baruch is going to say, very simply is, the ways of the Lord are not the ways of human beings. And so we're always going to misunderstand what the promise is. We will always misunderstand what the promise is. This is a wonderful cooperative venture between one of the Bruegels and Peter Paul Rubens, which brings together the peaceable kingdom on the one side and the fall on the other, so that the point they're trying to make is the point that both Isaiah and Baruch made. You will not understand what God is saying. You will misunderstand it because you are more preoccupied with your own ways of thinking and being in the world. And there's this wonderful, wonderful story of Ezekiel on the Valley of the Dry Bones. That's remarkable because Ezekiel, at least as it's understood in this panel that is in the synagogue of Dura Europa in Damascus. The most amusing thing about this is that what's going to be restored are the 10 lost tribes of Judah. Moreover, the dry bones are so dry that they are desiccated. There's just no life left in them. And it's a statement about us and how much no life is left in us. So then the task is to breathe into us a breath whereby we become a people. So revivifying the bones so they are now joined by tendons and covered with flesh and muscles and become vibrant. That is not resurrection for Ezekiel. For Ezekiel, resurrection is creating a people, bringing a people into being, a people that was lost. It's a very beautiful notion. Now, Zephaniah, and I've been giving portraits of each of these prophets that adorn the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And Michelangelo just has this wonderful, robust sense that every prophet that ever came down the line was just a giant of a human being. And so they're just huge. And Zephaniah is no exception. Now, what's interesting about Zephaniah is that he has a book that's very short. It's one of the shortest in the entire Bible. It contains only 3 chapters. And the first 2 chapters are blistering condemnations of Israel. I mean, there isn't you're just withering. You're pilloried. You're exhausted by the time he's done. And then, suddenly, in the 3rd book, he does this spin. And he says, "Sing aloud, O daughter Zion. Shout, O Israel. Rejoice and exult with all your heart, O daughter Jerusalem. The Lord has taken away the judgments against you. He has turned away your enemies. The King of Israel, the Lord, is in your midst. You shall fear disaster no more. On that day it shall be said to Jerusalem, do not fear, O Zion. Do not let your hands grow weak. The Lord your God is in your midst, a warrior who gives victory. He will rejoice over you with gladness. He will quiet you in his love. He will exult over you with loud singing as on a day of festival. I will remove disaster from you so that you will not bear reproach for it. I will deal with all your oppressors at that time. And I will save the lame and gather the outcast, and I will change their shame into praise and renown in all the earth. At that time I will bring you home, at that time when I gather you, for I will make you renowned and praised among all the peoples of the earth when I restore your fortunes. And I will restore your fortunes before your eyes. Now this little reversal is very much reminiscent of the kinds of reversals that we find in the Psalms. The psalmist warns, this is pretty stark stuff. If thou, Lord, shouldst mark iniquities, who could stand? In other words, God starts counting. We are all in trouble. And the very next thing he says is, but there is forgiveness with thee, that thou mayest be revered. So the point that we want to begin with is that biblical literature is full of sudden and unexpected reversals, like the one from judgment to forgiveness in this psalm. These often have to do with changes in circumstances and fortunes that give rise to new insight. Here the psalmist warns of uncompromising reckoning that is suddenly followed by mercy, which is the basis of the renewed wisdom that God should be revered. This leap from one opposite to another is very much characteristic of Zephaniah. This is a depiction of the next one, of Zephaniah as an icon. And this is the next one is a 17th century illumination in a biblical text from the book of Zechariah. And this is a remarkable statue on the side of a cathedral. However, this is my favorite. This is in the commons of the reading room of the Boston Public Library at Copley Square. I used to sit in that reading room, and I used to look up this. I didn't know on earth what it was, but I would look, so it was sort of a regular feature in my life. And then I found out, well, it's a frieze, a mural by John Singer Sargent. And in order, on the left is Zephaniah, and then Joel, and then Obadiah, and Hosea. Now, what Sargent wanted to underscore was the triumph of what he called true religion, that is Christianity, because in the rest of the library, there are all these wonderful murals of Roman and Greek religion, which were referred to not very flatteringly as pagan religion. So it was the triumph of true religion over pagan religion. That was his. But notice that the one who leads the panel is Zephaniah. Now, the leap from one opposite to the other, from promise to judgment, has been a feature of the vigil narratives that we've been reviewing together. And they all have these reversals. And all of these reversals have a communal lament. There's a cry from the very depth of human sadness, human sorrow, human suffering. Indeed, Augustine, with a little bit of wit, suggested that they foreground the abyss as if it were the belly of the whale in which Jonah was held captive. Even so, these stories all depart from a sense of God's promise and the conviction that the punishment of judgment is accompanied by the grace of forgiveness. Now, Isaiah does the very same thing. He starts with judgment and then moves to promise. So this is Isaiah 4:2, another one of the readings from the vigil. And it's really quite something. On that day, he's just been doing another withering criticism. Prophets, by the way, like to do that. They get up. They don't have very much nice to say about you. And by the time they're done, they turn around and say, yeah, but. And we all sigh a huge sigh of relief. On that day, the branch of the Lord shall be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the land shall be the pride and glory of the survivors of Israel. Whoever is left in Zion and remains in Jerusalem will be called holy. Everyone who has been recorded for life in Jerusalem, once the Lord has washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion and cleansed the blood stains of Jerusalem from its midst by a spirit of judgment and by a spirit of burning. Then the Lord will create over the whole site of Mount Zion and over its places of assembly a cloud by day and smoke, and the shining of a flaming fire by night. Indeed, over all the glory there will be a canopy. It will serve as a pavilion, a shade by day from the heat, and a refuge and a shelter from the storm and the rain. Now, this clearly invokes the wrath of God, and this is a wonderful painting by Carpaccio from 1491 of God's judgment, which is also referred to as God's glorification. It's very interesting. Now, there's also this wonderful love fest that goes on in Isaiah. The branch of the Lord shall be beautiful. So Rubens does what Rubens does best and gives us a depiction of this as an actual love fest. Here we turn to the basis of this really remarkable passage in Zephaniah that I want to talk to you about, and that is Psalm 131. The psalmist writes, and this is beautiful, I may say it twice because it's very short but exquisite. O Lord, I am not proud. I have not haughty looks. I do not occupy my mind with great matters or with things that are too hard for me. But you still my soul and make it quiet. Like a child upon its mother's breast, my soul is quieted within me. O Israel, wait upon the Lord from this time forevermore. All right, this is a little depiction of Psalm 131. And then the next one, this is my favorite. This says it so beautifully, this gathering, this quieting. So I'm going to read this one more time so that we keep it in mind. O Lord, I am not proud, I have no haughty looks. I do not occupy my mind with great matters or with the things that are too hard for me. But you still my soul and make it quiet. Like a child upon its mother's breast, my soul is quieted within me, O Israel. Wait upon the Lord from this time forevermore. Now, the change here is not from promise to judgment, but it has to do with the circumstances in which God's messianic presence is to be manifest. It's no longer the expectation of the Davidic Messiah. And Zephaniah echoes the psalmist, writing, Yahweh is in the midst of you. He will quiet you with his love. Isn't that beautiful? Yahweh is in the midst of you. He will quiet you with his love. Now, quieting with his love was not exactly what people were expecting to hear from the psalmist or from Zephaniah. In their context, which was the context of Davidic messianic hope, the idea was that there was the sanctity and divinely guaranteed perpetuity of the line of David as the reigning dynasty in Judah. So it's a military presence. The expectation was that an anointed deliverer would be God's vice-regent, redeeming others through a reign of justice, peace, and prosperity. Now, not everybody embraced this idea. Jeremiah, for one, combated it fiercely. Jeremiah thought it was a mistake, that was an old covenant, that there was a new covenant that had to be respected. Ezekiel went in an entirely different direction. Remember, he said, look, the new presence is not going to be a king. The new presence, this new life, is going to be a people. And the people that's raised up is resurrection. It's not some warlike figure. So this tradition is deep within the Jewish consciousness. And more, it's Yahweh, not a Davidic king, who's going to be the agent of deliverance. But now, let's just pause for a moment and think just a bit about this love, this quieting love that God brings when in the midst of us. What is it about it that makes it stand apart from all things? To begin, desire and excitement, which tend to stir us deeply, are nothing beside this love. Moreover, what is not love provokes it and quenches it, because it is not we who lay hold of love, but is love that lays hold of everything we know. Now, sometimes we get confused, and we think our passions are a path that are going to lead us somewhere. Then they may, but they do not bring us to love. Because we think of passion as fervor. And in thinking of passion as fervor, we walk right past what passion is. Passion is an affect. It's something that happens to us and causes a response from us. It is an inward disposition that arises from being acted upon. It is suffering. Now, suffering means, quite simply, being acted upon, attending to the ways in which the world and all that is within it acts upon us, more than thinking about what we do. St. Francis wrote this wonderful prayer that's referred to as the Serenity Prayer. And it is a prayer asking for wisdom. It says, "Grant me the serenity to accept what I cannot change, the courage to change what I can, and the wisdom to know the difference." The wisdom to know the difference. It's a prayer about understanding that over which we have power and that over which we do not. It's a prayer that talks about the centrality of suffering, which St. Francis understood so deeply. He lived a life of exquisite poverty. Now, the most important thing is that suffering and sorrow, as Francis would say, opens the castle of our spirit, wherein is hidden the mystery of love. The mystery of love, as Zephaniah sees it, is not the many kinds of desire that we equate with passion, because passions don't last. Passion ignites the fires of spirit but cannot sustain them. Desire imitates love, but as a mere facsimile, expires. Appetite devours itself because it cannot digest love. No passions last. Even love lapses, but in a way differing from passion. And this is the difficult but beautiful point that Zephaniah teaches us. Love lasts by not lasting. Now that sounds absolutely counter to all the things we've been taught about eternal love. But think about your own experience. A mother gathers the child to its breast and quiets it. But there comes a time when that has to stop. We can have a little humor here. Moms say, I need a break. This is starting to hurt. And all of you who've had children or been around children know that children are adorable until they're not. I had 4 of them, so I can attest with utter candor to they're completely wonderful until they're not. And then they become wonderful again. And then they're not. And they grow up. And they're supposed to be wonderful, but they're not. You throw them out into the world, and then they come back like a boomerang, kadoom, landing usually fairly close to your bank account. But there is this constant movement back and forth. You see, when we talk about love, when we talk about passion, it just burns upward. But love is this movement back and forth. It settles in a place and then it moves. It settles and it moves. And so what's lasting is that it doesn't just become static. What's lasting is that it comes again and again and again, but we know not when. It's not like we can say, okay, time for a little gentle love. It doesn't work that way. And it's not merely at birth. It's often times of death. You sit with someone, and quite unexpectedly, they reach out their hand and they take yours. And they say things, and you are totally changed. That's how I began this little set of meditations, with a person who had said, I feel just trashed. She was dying of cancer. I feel just trashed. And I said, but that's not the last word. And she reached out her hand. This was hard. I had known this woman for 28 years. She always called me Pacini. Pacini, when are you going to do this? Pacini, when are you going to do that? Okay. And all of a sudden she said, David. And I almost turned around to find out if there was somebody else in the room to whom she was speaking. And she finally allowed me in. And then the hand came and was very, very gentle. Or when my son died, a friend of mine would come and would walk for hours, not saying a word. And we come near the end, and he would just reach out and touch my shoulder. He never said a word. He would just touch my shoulder. Sometimes. And when it did, it was always grace. It was unexpected. I didn't say, okay, now it's going to happen. No, there was something about being in that solidarity that led to that quieting love. So love lasts by not lasting because it's in constant transformation, as opposed to everything else. It just becomes static. It becomes fixed. We have these objects in our mind of what it's supposed to be. We try to visit, importantly, what's unknown of love. We look at this statue of mother and child, and we claim with Hebrews that faith is the substance of things hoped for and of the evidence of things unseen. But sometimes we forget that we are speaking of ways of finding ourselves oriented, finding ourselves directed, finding ourselves being disposed, rather than speaking of marvelous possessions. We forget that when we reach out, we do so with the blindness of the prophet Simeon. Our eyes do not see, but they may receive vision. There was a 19th century Danish philosopher and theologian, the greatest writer Denmark has ever known, a man by the name of Søren Kierkegaard. We call him the Lonely Dane because he was so caught up in melancholy. But he never tired of reminding us that the quieting love, like being quieted at the breast, is always accompanied by separation. See that movement away and then coming back, away and back. Sadness, loss, mourning, and the threat of perishing all lurk in the corridors of separation from the source of our nurture. We're terrified by it. But so also, and this is Zephaniah's point, so also does the possibility of being enthralled in seeing and in heart by the marvel of this separating deed that begets faith and its symbolization. So we begin to imagine that it's not just about the literal thing. We begin to think that this is a way of talking about the love that sustains. And then we begin to fix imaginatively pictures in our minds that talk about this fountainhead of love from which we all want to drink. And we have to be ever so careful because we want to fix it and know it so clearly that we can hold on to it. But what makes it last is that we can't. We can't. Observing bright sorrow arises out of the grace-filled solidarity with others, all of whom have been separated from quieting love. We all know what quieting love is if we look deeply within ourselves, and we yearn for it. And so there's this welter of possible connectivity between us from which new life can come. So it is that love quietly quiets us repeatedly, empowering us to discern the fleeting shimmers of brightness just before the dawn. And then again, by grace, to reach out, to live into them, however briefly, until we live into them again. But now, perhaps, each time of living becomes more perceptive. Each moment that we know love deepens. We see what we didn't know before. We are granted new wisdom. I suspect that that's exactly what Zephaniah has in mind when he speaks of gathering a people. What does it mean to gather? It's to gather them around the spaces of their quiet. Their longing for the quiet. Their deep yearning for the touch of quieting love. He does not think that quieting love restores Judah to its original state. The people of Judah have erred, have betrayed their God, and have endured the punishing judgment of captivity to the Babylonians. This is a wonderful painting of the judgment. You can just feel the terror of it. And then in the next painting, we see the attempt to begin to talk about what love in the midst of us looks like. Sometimes it's represented as a pastoral scene. Next. And sometimes, as in this wonderful contemporary painting, it is all of the fish and forces of life coming together in this radiant sensibility. You know, that's the way in which this painter, Halevi Zephaniah, sees salvation in Zephaniah. So quieting love does not usher in the dynasty of Judah. Quieting love helps the people remember how they've been altered through the course of their lives, through the course of their separations. Quieting love manifests the incarnate connectivity of gentle intimacy between people that makes it possible to resurrect what it is to be a people. And that incarnate activity, while manifest through us, is not of us. It doesn't come from us. It proceeds through us. That's Zephaniah's point. It's the ruling activity of God, whose reign lasts by not lasting, ever altering, ever inspiring. The power of transformative love regenerates itself. This ruling activity diminishes and enlarges us. It separates us from the breast and joins us to ever stronger forms of spiritual nurture, which is what every parent does, is to bring more and more forms of spiritual nurture from which to give all of us a source of life. All of this occurs unexpectedly. You come around the corner, and there it is. And you never imagined it would be so, but there it is. It greets you, you don't make it. So just as darkness spills into dawn, and there's this intimation of brightness yet to come, there's also a shimmering summons of resurrection, in this case meant to be the bringing back to life the sense of being a people. A people. Think of how torn we are now. Think of how much we yearn for a world where we can be a people at peace, who love and care and nurture one another. That rhythm of intimate connectivity always is just beyond our grasp and comprehension. It is like the shimmering flowers on a pond. It is like the great rendering of Zephaniah, the next painting, by Tyler Quinn. The Lord is in the midst of thee. It's incomprehensible. And then there is our attempt to read together. This is a painting by Julius Paulson. It's a family trying to interpret Zephaniah. He calls it a matter of interpretation. It's in 1919 that he painted this. And then there's this last one, which is so, so, so lovely. And that is an altarpiece at Ghent. And it's peacemaking, music-making angels. It was painted in 1432. That's what quieting love is. The music of angels. That soothes us, calms us, calls us to be a people. It's really quite beautiful. It's a governance. It's a way in which we sense our world to be ordered. It is, as Isaiah said, the branch of the Lord. Beautiful, glorious, and to be revered. Thank you.